very briefly introduce you to introduce Bernard to you. So I'm from the CRGT lab in Toulouse. I'm a professor here in Toulouse. My name is José Braga, and I'm very, very honored to welcome Professor Bernard Wood for this conference. So very briefly, just to give you an idea of who Bernard is. You may know him already by name. Bernard is a medical doctor and he's a surgeon. And he received his diploma a long time ago in England. And he received also a PhD some decades ago. Not too much. It wasn't in the Paleolithic, but it was in the previous century. He was appointed in the University of London as a professor of anatomy, and then he moved to Liverpool, where he became the head director of the Department of Human Anatomy and Cell Biology, and he was also in Liverpool the Dean of the Medical Faculty. Then he moved to Washington, George Washington University in the late 19th, where he became Professor of Human Origins and Professor of Human Evolutionary Anatomy at George Washington University. And he was also elected Honorary Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons of England in 2007, and is presently the Director of the Center for the Advanced Study of Human Paleobiology at George Washington University. And Bernard has been one of the main friends and collaborator of Richard Leakey, and he did very important descriptions and analyses of all these beautiful fossil hominins that have been found in the Rift Valley long ago, starting in 1968. So thank you, Bernard, again for being here in Toulouse with us, and it's a great privilege to listen to you today.
Thank you very much. That was there's a little bio that I have that must be online, and most people just repeat it. So it's very nice to hear something different. Yeah. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you hear me? I mean, should I? Okay. It's a pleasure to be here. I have enormous respect for José. And the only two hominins I have ever found are half a talus and a mandible, and the bone of the mandible was so fragile that actually by the time we got to consolidate it, all that was left were the teeth. So I'm a parasite, really, on people who find fossils. My interest is really trying to work out what the fossil record means, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. So I'm just going to go through the slides, and if you have any questions, you should just ask me as we go. I went to medical school in 1964, and these were the hominins that were known of then. On the left is the age that we now know they are. In other words, not necessarily the age when they were discovered. And on the left are modern humans, little red box. Modern humans, we should remind ourselves, have only been around for about 300,000 years. That's sort of more or less consistent with the molecular evidence, maybe a little older. And when you think that most of these extinct hominins lasted a lot longer than that, we should not regard them as unsuccessful, as we tend to regard them. The horizontal axis is really ill-defined. You just need some way of spreading things out. In general, things with large brains are on the left, and organisms with large post-canine teeth are on the right. And so in 1964, 1964, the Leakeys, Lewis and Mary Leakey, had recently discovered Paranthropus boisei, which is the column on the far right. And in that year, they had described Homo habilis, which is the light blue column. And the assumption was really that apart from the robust Australopithecines, which are the dark colors, and the colors are really about grades, they're not about relationships. And what you will notice about all these diagrams is that there are no lines. I am not sure what is related to what. And so I'm afraid there are no lines. So there are no hypotheses of relationships in these diagrams. At that time, there was no molecular evidence, or very little molecular evidence, to suggest that modern humans were particularly closely related to one or other of the living apes. And so the terminology was that you were either a hominid, in other words, you belonged to the family Hominidae, or you were a pongid, and that you belonged to the family Pongidae, and that the apes were more closely related to each other than any were to modern humans. It was realized there was enough molecular evidence to think that modern humans were more closely related to the African apes than to orangs. But nonetheless, it was believed that bonobos and chimpanzees and gorillas were more closely related to each other than either were to modern humans. And it's important for us to realize this sort of context, because I'm really convinced that one of the most important advances in our understanding of human evolutionary history has got nothing to do with the fossil record. It's got everything to do with working out the relationships of the great apes to modern humans and to each other. Because that gives us some sort of context in which we can interpret the fossil record. And the conventional wisdom these days is that bonobos and common chimpanzees are more closely related to modern humans than they are to gorillas. Now, this will probably come as some surprise to bonobos or chimpanzees which are in a zoo where there are gorillas and orangutans. And it would be an interesting conversation to see what they thought, that they were actually more closely related to the people that buy tickets and go to the zoo and eat ice cream than to other apes in the zoo. And that, I think, has all sorts of implications that we tend not to consider. We should consider. And so hominins, it no longer makes sense, and you all know this, but it no longer makes sense to discriminate between modern humans and any of the apes at the level of the family. And so people tend to discriminate at the level of the tribe or the subtribe. And so hominins is the name that we normally give. Not everybody, because there are some people who feel strongly that we should still use hominid, but I personally think it's more sensible to think about us and our close relatives as hominins. Exactly when we shared a common ancestor with bonobos and common chimpanzees, if you look at the molecular evidence, it's some people think it might be as early as 11 or 10 million years ago. Some people think it might be as recent as 6 or 5 million years ago. So I'm just using 8 million years as a sort of as a happy medium. So how do we advance our understanding of that, the branch of the tree of life which I've outlined in yellow? Well, it's not rocket science. You either have to find evidence or you have to find smarter ways of interrogating PhD. If you have a plan for your PhD, it should be, you should be able to just write it on the back of a postcard. And the theory is that if you're not doing anything that's related to what's on your postcard, then you aren't working. So you should, most people's PhD should be pretty simple. It seems very complicated, but the questions should be pretty simple. So we either find more evidence or we improve the analytical methods. The more evidence can either be more fossils, and these days it could be molecular evidence. Jose is a master at finding more fossils, but there are people who have managed to extract DNA from fossils, and these days also there are all sorts of advances in proteomics, which will yield dividends, I'm sure, in the next few years. You can also extract more evidence from the fossils that you have. And the way that we do that, or the ways that we do that, is to use imaging methods to see what's inside the fossil, basically. And on the left is a radiograph that we took in the 1970s in Nairobi. The only X-ray machine was a machine that came from Nairobi Hospital. It was no longer up to date, and so we brought it to the museum, and we brought some X-ray film, and most of the images were just black. We had no idea how long to expose it for. We had no idea. And so, slightly in exasperation, we turned all the knobs on the X-ray machine to the maximum, and we went off to have a cup of tea. And we came back, and that was the image. So really scientific. It depends how long it takes to get a cup of tea at the Duker at the museum. And but things are a lot more sophisticated, and Jose uses micro CT, and this is some work that Matt Skinner did, because we reasoned that the enamel dentine junction reflects the development of the tooth probably rather more closely than the outer enamel surface, because the outer enamel surface is how the ameloblasts interpret the enamel dentine junction. And so we reasoned that the enamel dentine junction was probably a little closer to the genome than the outer enamel surface. And I know some of you are working on that, and that's what Matt Skinner did for his PhD. You can also extract stable isotopes from fossils, especially from enamel, and you can get some idea from carbon isotopes about what sort of vegetation the hominins were eating. Later on, I suspect the carbon isotope signal reflects the diet of the meat that the hominins were eating. But initially, I think it reflected the vegetation that the hominins were eating themselves. And there are recent methods that are being developed in Germany using nitrogen to see whether they were eating meat. And so if you combine the nitrogen and the carbon, you should be able to tell whether the carbon isotope signal reflects their consumption of vegetation, or whether it reflects their consumption of meat, which reflects the consumption of whatever the prey animals were eating.